Shabbat Shalom. This week, the people of Israel are once again standing at the foot of the plateau of Moab, just awaiting to enter into the land of Israel. And Moses is in his third part of his discourse to the Israelites, just preceding their entry into the land of Israel. And if you recall the first part of Moses' discourse to the Israelites, it began in Parshat Devarim, at the very beginning of Deuteronomy, and included that portion included Moses chastising the Israelites for forsaking God in the desert with the golden calf incident. The second part of Moses' discourse picks up in Parshat Be'et-Hanan, and that included Moses criticizing the Israelites for being a stiff-necked people. And the third part of Moses' discourse picks up in Parshat Re'eh and includes Moses finally laying down the law to the Israelite people with the mitzvot and the moral, civil, and criminal codes of law. As discussed in our earlier weeks, the third part of Moses' discourse is heavily situated in moral codes. After all, recall from the last two Torah portions, we discussed the text, justice, justice, you shall pursue, from Parshat Shoftim of last week, and the dimension of social justice in Parshat Re'eh just before that. This week, we enter the Torah reading of Parshat Ki Teitzei. Our Torah reading of this week does not disappoint regarding the continuation of the themes of moral code from the third part of Moses' discourse to the Israelites. Our Torah reading of this week describes 74 of the 613 mitzvot in our tradition. And the mitzvot described in this week's Torah portion are ideologically and thematically bent toward the overtones of social justice described in our earlier Torah portions. However, the text of this week's Torah portion is much more direct, particularly regarding social justice as it relates to the theme of labor relations. Most specifically, our reading this week gives a set of laws that govern employer-employee relationships. For instance, this week, we read about the responsibility that employers have to not withhold pay from employees. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 14 of this week, it speaks to this exactly with, "You shall not defraud a poor and destitute laborer, whether a fellow countryman or a stranger." And the following verse, we read, "Employers must pay wages on the same day before the sun sets, for the employees may be poor and because it is desperately needed." Our Torah reading this week also describes how employees must be offered time to eat and rest while on the job. More defined in Deuteronomy chapter 23, actually it's verse 24 that states that of hungry workers, when they enter into a fellow's vineyard, they may eat as many grapes as they want until they are full. Our medieval rabbinic sages have interpreted this exact verse to mean that employers are commanded to allow food processing workers to eat from the produce they are working with, and it is more widely understood as a requirement for employers to offer lunch breaks during working hours for employees. Yet our discourse into labor relations in this week's Torah portion, it would be incomplete without its most prolific quotation from Deuteronomy, dealing with slavery. Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 16 states plainly, "You shall not turn over to a master a slave that seeks refuge with you." This exact verse juxtaposes our Jewish teachings and tradition with the ultimate abuse of labor, of slavery. Instead, our tradition teaches that if a slave escapes, we have a responsibility to uphold ethical standards of labor. Our Torah portion seems to focus on labor relations out of concern of and for employees being mistreated by employers. The outcome of mistreatment would be a workforce disenfranchised in a society. Further cementing this point are the prohibitions described in this week's Torah reading against capitalizing on the financial distress of the poor. And our reading from Deuteronomy this week also mentions that employers or private individuals may not offer loans with interest on the bare essential items for living. That includes food, water, and shelter. But why? Why would all these laws on labor regulations be relevant in antiquity or even today? That's the question. Unfortunately, it is not hard for some of us to imagine the following scenario. Imagine today someone working for, $7.25 an hour. By the way, that's the federal minimum wage. If you worked a 40-hour work week, you would earn about $15,000 a year. And as of 2021, 28% of American workers say they make below $15 an hour. Correlating with these data points is the knowledge we all have that around 10% of Americans currently live under a poverty line. So do not think for a second that these are just statistics, that these are just numbers, or that they do not impact our community. We have members in our Jewish community here in Columbus, Georgia, and everywhere elsewhere who fall into these categories. Members who work hard day and night just to stay alive, to pay for meals, to have insurance, and to squeak by. These members of our community also include near and distant family members. It includes our children, our siblings, our cousins, and even our parents. It is no fair way to live, but it is the way many are forced to make ends meet. This may surprise many of you at home this evening, but in rabbinical seminary, and directly as a result of COVID-19, many of my classmates during their seminary training found themselves in the lowest economic stratum of the United States. Some students qualified for Medicaid, and some were on food stamps. The rabbinical students felt financial stress across the board as a result of COVID-19, some more than others. However, the experience was eye-opening for many of us. Going from paying for health insurance in the marketplace to suddenly not was actually a relief to many. It was a social net many of us needed until we were back on our own feet. Yet it occurred to many of my colleagues at this moment that the social net easily could become an entrapment. If given the choice of struggling to get by on a minimum wage or through a labyrinth of welfare entitlements, most of us had imagined a more attractive option in not working, and the option was, frankly, the only option during COVID. However, as we know, in order for a labor force to have voice, workers must be able to work, and they must be undaunted by the allure of escaping into social entitlements. The traditional voice of labor relations is a defined Jewish one. And make no mistake, think back to your social studies classes and your history classes. The Bund, the Workers' Circle, the Jewish Labor Committee, they were all founded upon the principles and ideals found in this week's Torah portion. Even the Religious Action Committee of Reform Judaism today is active in the bipartisan support of campaigns for Raise the Wage and Family Act. On the landing page of the website for the Religious Action Committee of Reform Judaism's website is the verse from this week's Torah portion. If you go there, you'll find, "You shall not abuse a needy and destitute laborer. You must pay out the wage due on the same day, before the sun sets, for the worker is needy and urgently depends on it." Departing from our biblical text and applying it to our lives today, let us work to build a brighter tomorrow. Let us unite as workers and employees in this shared vision. for the sake of our mutual Jewish values and our tradition. Let us not forget the words of our Torah reading of this week, and let us always uphold the rights of workers. By doing so, we are ensuring a brighter, stronger tomorrow for all of us. Ken Yehi Ratzon.